I'm delighted. I'm feeling a little disconcerted here because the absolute best place for me to connect with the microphone is precisely where I can't see any of you. So I will try to speak really loudly. Will this do? Hoping that the mic will pick it up. I do want to start. We are running behind because of the sheer gorgeousness of St. Jude's Day. There's so much to celebrate. We may have been overly ambitious in trying to... Oh, if you could put it right there, that would be great. That would be great because I can then put papers on there. Fabulous. Yes. I'm happy.
We can move the computer down too.
No, because then I lose this place. I will not fall, said she with optimism. There we go. So I do want to begin by saying thank you to especially people who have planned this day. It has so much in it, and I imagine that you will see considerable confluence and congruence between what I say and what Kate said in her sermon. Not surprisingly, because it is the same subject, but it was as though we had coordinated, and in fact, we did not coordinate. But you will see how the two pieces, the sermon and the secular historian speaking, come together. I do thank clergy and vestry for the support of the work that I do. And I'm grateful, too, for the friends whom I have, especially in small groups, Sacred Ground, Sacred Text Study, the Reparations Committee, Morning Prayer, for the kind of thinking that those conversations afford that enable me to think clearly about this matter of mission and service over the last 2 centuries. This material is extremely difficult to organize. It is literally all over the map, even within the chronology of 2 centuries and 215 additional years. But there's lots that overlaps. It is like the proverbial tasks of organizing kittens or getting ducks in a row. It's really, really hard, and I hope that I have made some sense of it and that I won't do too much repeating or overlapping. I should warn you ahead of time that there are certain things that I'm not going to cover that might be expected to be covered in a talk like this, but there isn't time or space to do it all. So I'm not going to be talking about early 19th century, pre-Civil War church planting all over the United States, which was initiated by St. Michael's. I'm not going to be talking about the cemetery, an extraordinary story and a mission in and of itself. This is not biography-based, even though individual inspirations for missions and ministries have come from our individual rectors and their families. And I'm also not going to talk about our foreign missionaries and our foreign mission support systems. I will do my best to organize the remaining rich material in a way that I hope makes sense for you. And as always, I base what I do in sacred text, and I see from some squinting there that you can't see much of what's written up there. I'll give you the main idea. The first sacred text is from the letter of Jude, who writes, "To those who are called, beloved in the Father, kept safe for Jesus, may mercy, peace, and love be yours in abundance." This is a wish that Jude, our patronal saint today, had for all of us, those with power and those powerless, that all should have mercy, peace, and love. The letter of St. Jude is a tough and sturdy piece, but there are some reinforcing and nurturing elements to it, as especially in the phrase, "Build yourselves up on your most holy faith." I turn also to the baptismal covenant. The celebrant says, "Will you seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself," calling up the texts about love as the first great commandment and the exhortation to love ourselves as our neighbors. We respond, "I will with God's help." And then, "Will you strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being?" "I will with God's help." Those are basic promises to ourselves, to each other, to the divine, which anchor us in the work of mission and ministry that we do. There are lots of ways to think about mission and ministry. There are cold tools for analysis for every possible mission and ministry: who created it, what caused its creation, who did the actual work, whom did it benefit, how was it funded, how long did it last. All those questions are ways of thinking about each ministry. But what's really important to bear in mind is that every ministry is organic. It's constantly shape-shifting. It's influenced by what goes on around it and what develops from within it. So tools for analysis are useful, but they're only a beginning place. And they're not what we're going to concentrate on this afternoon, but it's important to have them in the back of your mind. Finally, in terms of context, I want to remind you about basic chronology. The first 20 years, essentially, of our church's history involved an experiment. Would this little church last in this country that itself was still an experiment? We didn't know. It was a tentative, shaky beginning. We weren't strong financially. It was genuinely experimental. The initial so-called parish of St. Michael's extended from what would be modern-day 57th Street up to Westchester, from the Hudson over to the Bronx, including those islands in the East River. Who could possibly know what might happen in that vast, expanse of space? And then there followed this extraordinary century, the Richmond Peters century, that did embody Episcopal Church ideals of service. Those 4 rectors in a row achieved a generational legacy of mission. Each man was differently gifted and surrounded by family and women, insufficiently sung, who supported what they did. After that century, which took us into the end of the Gilded Age, World War I, and the chaos of the 1920s and 30s, everything was upended. Old ways of doing church simply didn't exist anymore. There were new kinds of urban need, and there were also new kinds of legal and government regulations for missions and ministries. And finally, starting around the time of both the United States bicentennial, 1976, and the arrival of Fred Hill in that same year, we began a new way of thinking about who were the people of St. Michael's as society itself was recasting how it thought about identity. And that work goes on to this day. That was some of what Kate talked about this morning. Our very first exercise in ministry or mission work, which is not coincidentally the subject of this month's Then and Now column, Then and Now in the Messenger. It's a monthly collaboration between me and John Stickney. We always look to see what in the past has a legacy now. And the very first mission work was our church charity school. It didn't last very long. It was very small. It was conceived of at a time when we still didn't have all that much money. And so it was somewhat of a risk. We employed a man named William Morgan and paid him $400 a year to teach an average of 40 boys and girls in 4 quarters of each year. It was a full year-round thing. On the one hand, this was a response to what St. Michael's saw as a need in its immediate neighborhood. On the other hand, it was also typical of what churches in general, Presbyterian, Methodist Episcopal churches were doing to sponsor and have neighborhood schools. So, for instance, our companion church, St. James, on the east side, with whom we shared rectors for the first 20 years, they also had a little school. So it was a normal thing to do, but you could only do it if you decided to do it, and St. Michael's decided to do it. City and state legislation, regulations changed, and so just as St. Michael's was thinking to itself, maybe we really can't afford to do this church, this school, we don't have the money for it. At the same time, the city was saying, really, we need to have a public school system. And so St. Michael's Church Charity School became a public school. And that legacy of church schools to the public school system is a pattern that we see all around the Diocese of New York. I'm going to do a quick chronological swing with you. I hope to walk in a pretty straight line through a truly tortured, rocky territory here, from the City Mission Society to Episcopal Social Services to the Sheltering Arms. The City Mission Society was founded in 1823, not by St. Michael's, but by colleague churches. St. Michael's certainly supported it. It didn't do very well. In 1849, St. Michael's did found the Mission to Public Institutions, and John Pinette Peters wrote about that in 1907, saying, "The mission to public institutions was organized in 1849 and intended to reach the poorest and most neglected classes in the city, the strata still underlying those whom the city mission had sought to serve. The transition from city mission society to mission to public institutions continued through a dizzying and exhausting array of shifts in governance structure and name changes until it settled for a while, about 50 years, on the New York Protestant Episcopal City Mission Society. And the picture of the little girl there that you see is on the cover of The Witness in 1959, which presented a history of then the New York Protestant Episcopal City Mission Society, which claimed as its main functions commitment to family services, port and immigration services, Westfield State Farm, which is now Bedford Correctional Institute for Women, chaplaincies, all chaplaincies throughout the Diocese of New York, clinical pastoral training, and St. Barnabas House. We'll come back to St. Barnabas House in a moment. Only in the last 2 years has the New York Protestant Episcopal City Mission Society, which had morphed into Episcopal Social Services, has it recently morphed into the Sheltering Arms. And the Sheltering Arms, as of 2020, claimed as its main areas of support education, youth development, juvenile justice reform, foster care, and adoption. And this is part of the mission statement from 2020 for the Sheltering Arms. And remember that name, Sheltering Arms. At Sheltering Arms New York, we believe that every child and family deserves an equal chance at success. Our mission is to strengthen the education, well-being, and development of vulnerable children, youth, and families across the New York metro area so that everyone has the support and opportunity needed to maximize their potential. Through innovation and partnerships, we enable low-income children and families to take steps towards brighter futures free from the challenges of generational poverty. Today, the Sheltering Arms touches the lives of approximately 20,000 New Yorkers every year. And as you will see in a moment, the origin of the Sheltering Arms lies with St. Michael's. The first mid-19th century mission that I want to tell you briefly about is St. Barnabas House. It was started during the Civil War, a period of extraordinary displacement throughout the city. And it was developed, designed, administered by Mrs. William Richmond after the death of her husband. It didn't last very long as an independent institution. It would be absorbed into the Mission Society. It was a residential program for homeless and destitute women. And the picture here is a particularly, I think, lovely picture. It's an optimistic picture, and it was sketched, painted by Winslow Homer during that 18-year period when he was serving as an illustrator for Harper's Weekly. I want to go on to tell you about the House of Mercy, which was similarly a mid-19th century project initiated by St. Michael's, and it ended up in an awful way. It started out as an entirely personal project of Mrs. Richmonds, the same Mrs. Richmond who started St. Barnabas House. And some of these pictures and stories may be familiar to you from various then and now articles, but I hope to weave them together for you to create a bigger picture. So the house on your left there, the House of Mercy, was the original House of Mercy at 86th Street, where Mrs. Richmond started this ministry. And this description that I want to read for you is from the New York Times. This is 1861. We surprised the superintendent, Mrs. Richmond, in the midst of operations upon refractory window pulleys. She said she had waited long and in vain for her friends of better days, the boss carpenters and masons, to send her the usual batch of workmen for a day's lift in repairing the premises. But this year, time wore on till patience no longer sat her throne of virtue, when the warm June days came on apace and the time-honored window cords refused their office. No one at the New York Times still writes like that. Air must be had, the sweet briar lavish of its perfume must not be shut out, and the indefatigable proprietress, seeing no prospect of a helping hand save through an undesirable draft upon the exchequer, determined to apply herself to the unaccustomed task. Judging from the specimens of masonry, lead pipe repairing, gardening, trenching, and the like, the will manifest will probably suggest a way to overcome this difficulty as well. This institution was set up for the reclamation and saving of youthful prostitutes and those who are liable to become such by reason of their home surroundings. I want you to notice a couple of important things here. Mrs. Richmond, and this is characteristic of the institutions set up by St. Michael's. St. Michael's, Mrs. Richmond, the Richmonds who would administer these institutions, the Peterses, did not make a distinction that others did between worthy and unworthy poor. And there was no assumption on the part of St. Michael's that there was an identity between poverty and criminality. Instead, there was a sense that poverty was a cause for criminality, and that the important project was to get rid of the poverty. Again, in 1861, going back to this Times article, there are 30 young girls at present in the institution. These are all taught the plain, essential branches of education, let their tastes be as they may, while those having intelligence adapted to higher branches are instructed therein by Mrs. Helena Richmond, a niece of the principal. You see once again the Richmond women playing a prominent role here. The building was once occupied as a country seat by a wealthy New York family, a St. Michael's vestry family, and many evidences of past grandeur are still perceptible, lending an air of romance to the spacious halls and deep-windowed saloons. It contains 27 different apartments and is calculated to accommodate comfortably 100 unfortunates who may be wise enough to seek its refuge. Mrs. Richmond has been joined in her enterprise and praiseworthy efforts for the fallen by many benevolent men as well as women. The money has come from rich individuals who have given to the project, who have given to the enterprise. That was the original funding. And so faithfully have they labored that the establishment is now almost paid for, and will in a few years become the property of those who have lent their whole time, energy, and wisdom to make it truly what it professes to be, a home for those not yet calloused in the walks of sensual sin. That was not how it remained. After Mrs. Richmond's death, the House of Mercy was briefly administered by the community of St. Mary, and when they decided to no longer engage in that, it was moved to an independent and never overseen, quite sloppily administered Board of Trustees. There was a good amount of individual money from individual trustees, enough so that when the original House of Mercy on 86th Street simply was not large enough, they moved up to Inwood in 1891. That's the picture on the upper right. And they were there until 1926. But the House of Mercy in that era is a good example of how institutions without any kind of oversight can go wrong. There were stories reported throughout the United States of horrific abuse, of corporal brutality. Girls and women were punished. The first sign of punishment was that their heads were shaved, they were starved, they lived in filth, and there were several court cases alleging abuse until finally in 1926 the institution was closed by New York State. And the picture on the bottom right was taken in 1932 after the House of Mercy had been totally abandoned. It was just a building in the wild. And this picture was taken just before it was torn down and Inwood Park was built. We move on now to the Sheltering Arms. And this is, in some ways, one of the centerpieces of this story. Thomas McClure Peters was concerned about children for whom there was no reasonable institutional place. And this is his son's, John Pinette Peters' description of his sense of the original purpose of the Sheltering Arms. And he was so committed to this that he and his wife, Alice, and their many children, moved out of the house that you see there on the lower left at 101st in Amsterdam, which is where the Sheltering Arms was located during its first decade. This is John Pinette Peters writing about who came to the Sheltering Arms. It seemed to Thomas McClure Peters necessary to establish an institution to care for such children as were not admissible elsewhere, and he proposed also so to extend its scope that it might become a means of taking charge temporarily of children during periods of family distress. Sometimes through sickness or desertion by a husband, a woman was left with little children to provide for. She could go out and get work for their support if she could only find a home in which to place them temporarily until her husband's recovery or reform, or until they had grown old enough to earn something themselves and unite with her in making a home. Similarly, husbands, when temporarily left with children whom they did not wish to surrender, and for whom they yet had at that moment no way of providing. Institutions then existing demanded the complete surrender of children. Mr. Peters, this is John Finette Peters writing about his father, Mr. Peters' plan was to keep parents in touch with their children, to let them contribute as much as they could for their children, and to hand their children back to them again at the earliest possible moment so that the family life might continue. The Times summarized the mission this way: "In this house, therefore, provision is made for children who, although neither orphans nor friendless, are as much in need of a home as though they were both." This was the origin in the United States of what would become the foster care system. The notion that you take children whose parents can only partially support them, whose parents need to be away from them while they get themselves together, and take care of them, and then return them to an intact family. This notion was a radical and new notion, and it was St. Michael's. It's one of St. Michael's most important contributions. By 1869, Thomas McClure Peters' private home had so completely outgrown, the needs had so completely outgrown the space that a new building was needed. And so, as the grid system designed by the city commissioners in 1811 finally moved uptown in the 1860s and 70s, in spite of the upheavals of the Civil War, by 1869 and 1870, the Sheltering Arms building at Amsterdam Avenue and West 129th Street was built. And the two images on your right there are that building. It was a huge building, and within the building there were communities or houses in which children lived together in something like a family setting. Additional buildings were built. On the left, you have two other views of the main building. On the right, you have the girls' playground. Again, this same main building at 129th Street, which meant, by the way, that some of the clergy and spiritual support of the Sheltering Arms came from St. Mary's, Manhattanville, our first daughter church, even though Thomas McClure Peters was still the president of it. And more cottages for the cottage system, family system way of caring for the children were built. These are three pictures of the Furness cottage. The Furness sisters were part of the wealthy family that we know best because of Elizabeth Zimmerman, the only one of the three sisters to marry, who gave us the money for that chapel, and then St. Jude's. The Furness cottage was given by Sophia Furness in memory of her mother. It had its own playground and its own cottage dining room. There were about 5 other cottages around that main building around 129th Street. When the IRT was completed and had a stop there by 1904, and the city had really come up, the countryside setting in which those cottages had been built was essentially destroyed. And those groups of children were placed in other buildings further uptown and in the other boroughs. This was part of the beginning of the Sheltering Arms growth into other boroughs. But the memory within the neighborhood of the Sheltering Arms remained. In 1945, a playground called the Sheltering Arms Playground was built, also a pool, and it was redesigned in 1968. These pictures are pre-COVID pictures, and I don't know that you can see it, but I wish you could. You have to pretend that you could see it. In the bigger picture on the right, in the upper left-hand corner, you can see the back of the cross facade of St. Mary's Church. So this is the Manhattanville location of the Sheltering Arms. The Sheltering Arms had an incredibly important place within the Manhattanville neighborhood for decades. I want to bring us back to St. Michael's. From the 1890s through the 1960s, we maintained a free clinic. Sometimes it was called the Bloomingdale Free Clinic, sometimes it was called St. Michael's Clinic, sometimes it was called the District Nurse Association. It went through all kinds of different organizations, and by this time, by the first half of the 20th century, individual private funding was no longer possible. Funding for any mission like this had to involve a state-regulated system of governance with a board of trustees with certain rules and guidelines, and there was government funding as well. These were two of several publicity pictures taken in 1950, and I really like them. This is the Donovan. Mrs. Donovan is the clinic nurse, and this is the Palmer family. On the left, we say, this is Dan Rice, who's the photographer who's written the captions on the back. On the left, Mrs. William Donovan, the clinic staff nurse, gives Mrs. Madeline Palmer advice on diet of her daughter, Patricia, age 3. And there's Mrs. Palmer looking lovingly at a rather puzzled-looking little girl. And on the right, we have the same family. I really like Mrs. Palmer's blouse and skirt. We have the same family, and the photographer has written, Mrs. Palmer looks on as her husband, Philip, observes their 6-month-old daughter, Barbara, after examination. Patricia, age 3, and there she is again, you see her little white barrette, and Philip, age 1.5, were also examined. Stephen Boley, whom some of you may remember, who was a priest here, told a story of a man who simply wandered in one afternoon. This happens a fair amount at St. Michael's. He simply wandered in and asked to talk to someone, and he made his way to Stephen's office, and he wanted to say thank you because as a little boy in the 1950s and 60s, he had had his teeth taken care of in the dental part of the District Nurse Association's offices. And he was always grateful that he had good teeth, and he just wanted St. Michael's to have his thanks. We don't know, we never know how mission and ministry ends up affecting individual lives. Mission and ministry starts with an individual spiritual call, and its successes are measured by the lives it touched. And stories like that bring us to that knowledge. I think that the knitting that goes on here is important as an example of the kind of spiritual work that can be done that is entirely personal and intimate. What could be more private and astonishing than the creation of fabric, creating something from nothing for someone in companionship with other people? And then its connection with a major institution within the church, the Siemens Church Institute. I like these photos. You have to forgive the photographer. She's never been a very good photographer, and she had a new camera then. But the general feeling of blessing when Susan and Liz, and I think that's Carol there, were standing before this bounty of knitted goods that would go to the church, the Siemens Church Institute, to keep mariners all over the world warm, is something really special. So we see a full range of mission and ministry from the most institutional to the most intimate and personal. And that organic, complex, constantly evolving range of mission and ministry brings us to where we are now in a slide that has jumped the text all around, so I will read it to you. We have now an outreach committee, which is doing really quite remarkable work. And this is the mission statement. The outreach committee discerns our neighbors' needs. It inspires and supports volunteer programs to meet those needs. It engages members of the parish to live out their baptismal covenant through service to others. It encourages a welcoming spirit. It inspires outreach that is not solely transactional, but that transforms all involved. This mission statement was written this year and was emailed to me by Ned Boyajian, to whom I'm tremendously grateful. And he went on to explain something of what that meant. He added in an email just this week, all this translates into helping the leaders of the Saturday Kitchen. The Saturday Kitchen is something that deserves its own whole talk. Founded in 1983, it is an extraordinary ministry. So this outreach mission statement translates into helping the leaders of the Saturday Kitchen, of homework help, midnight marauders, bread bandits, and other missions brainstorm ideas, troubleshoot, recruit volunteers, and we are also engaged in conversations with individual organizations in the neighborhood and beyond, seeking opportunities for partnerships with the parish and for individual parishioners to contribute their talents. This is the kind of work, the work of conversation and collaboration of individuals listening to a spiritual call to justice that creates projects such as our reparations committee and the determination to see that our doors are wide open to all. All this kind of spiritual work at an individual, small group level leads us to where we are in terms of thinking about third century mission. I want to come to some concluding thoughts here. St. Michael's has a genuinely remarkable history of mission and service and contribution to our city and to our diocese. Is it enough? No. We feed the hungry. We do not yet know how to eliminate the hunger. Eliminating hunger and want, deprivation, exploitation is both a political and a spiritual project. Some of what St. Michael's does is typical of the Episcopal Church locally and nationally at its best. And some of what it does is unique to St. Michael's. And I've tried to think about what it is that makes St. Michael's missions and ministries unique. And I should say that I feel in some ways ill-equipped for this task and well-equipped. Ill-equipped because St. Michael's has really been my only church home in my life. I came here some 30 years ago when my child was 4 or 5. He's now a marvelous man with 2 children of his own. And at the same time, because I participate in a church-wide organization, the National Association of Episcopal Historians and Archivists, I do get a chance to visit other churches and other dioceses throughout our Episcopal Church, both in the continental United States and beyond. So I do think that what we share with the best of other churches and dioceses is that we listen when the Holy Spirit calls us to think about how to shape faith into action and gives us support for doing that. What I think is unique to St. Michael's is that we have an exceptionally strong, currently and at various times during the past, we have an exceptionally strong collaboration between clergy and lay leadership. Not just vestry, but lay leaders beyond the vestry as well. And the clergy has been careful to nurture the development of lay leadership. There is a generous responsiveness to the spiritual call to justice here, and there is a willingness, and this has been true in phases throughout our history, and it is, I think, true now. There's a willingness to make the shape of this call to justice integral to our identity. I want to tell you a little bit about this picture and this quotation. Kate told the story in the sermon this morning about the St. Jude's altar. The picture, and I'm sorry, you may not be able to see it very clearly here. This is the picture of which I cherish. It's right next to my work table at home, scotch taped to the bulletin board right next to it. This is on the porch out there when we opened up the crate that exposed St. Jude's altar. So that wooden beam that you see was part of the support beam for the front of the crate. And you see the dirt, you see the filth, You can't see the inscription in the lower right dedicating the altar to John Pinette Peters. I cherish this picture because when those of us who were on the Bicentennial Committee and some members of the maintenance staff opened up the crate that day, there was this sense of astonishment at its elegant beauty, even in the dirt and detritus that the crate couldn't keep out. There was this sense of astonishment at its beauty. There was a new wave of shame that we had kept this hidden. And there was a great flush of optimism that we were going to do the right thing. So this picture for me brings me the kind of joy that I feel when I look at it, that I feel also when I look at St. Jude's altar currently in place. Those of you who know me, especially in small group conversations and in morning prayer, have heard me quote this sentence from Florida Howard, our St. Jude's vicar, early in his ministry at St. Jude's, but I keep coming back to it. We are slowly building up a center of civic righteousness, and the work done counts for the kingdom of God. In the Lord's Prayer, on earth as in heaven, the kingdom of God on earth as in heaven, we don't ever get there. The project is political, the project is spiritual, but we are engaged in it. And as Kate said this morning, St. Jude's continues to inspire us, as do some of these missions and ministries that have had such remarkable legacies of St. Michael's. So we are late in the day. You have been patient in a long celebratory day. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so glad, and I would love to take any questions that you have, but also if you are ready to get out of here, skitter away, please do that, but thank you so much for being here. Ned.
Jeannie, thank you. That was extraordinary. It was moving and informative and just wonderful. Thank you. I have a question about the altar. I was told this at the time when it was still on the portico, and I want to know if it's true. If the story I heard is true or not. You're the one to tell me. What I heard was that there was some concern about moving it inside because it looked so big and heavy. And someone was even afraid that the floor might support it, but it turned out that behind the facade of the altar was a series of blocks, so they were able to just kind of...
It's not a series of blocks, it is hollow. We hired John Stickney, do you remember his name? Mariana may too. We hired a remarkable conservator from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Right. Right, and we were very concerned about how heavy it was going to be and whatnot. He came and looked at it, and it turned out it's hollow. And so that's why we were able to move it in. Thank heavens it was hollow. That's probably how they were able to get it into St. Jude's. The chapel was on the second floor. So that's probably how they were able to get it in. Anything else? I will let you all go. Thank you all so much for coming. Take care. Bye-bye.